African history, pre-colonial African trade complexes. Pre-colonial African trade complexes. Prior to colonial rule, Africans engaged themselves in trade. First of all, trade within given societies, which one can term as intra-society trade, in which members/citizens of a given society would exchange goods and services amongst themselves. Such exchanges depended on individual performance and output as well as skill. However, with new developments in the history of mankind such as increase in population, advancement in technology, and political development which involved expansion of societies and the evolution of state systems and changes in human demands, they then developed a new kind of trade relationship among societies and what can be referred to as intersocietal trade relations, in which one state or society traded with another. Such trade relations developed partly because of the differences in ecosystems in Africa. Different parts in Africa belong to different ecosystems. Given such differences, different societies/systems produced different goods, something that necessitated exchange. In East Africa, for example, there were some societies that were cattle keeping while others were crop growers. So exchange was inevitable. Uganda, for example, was a crop cultivating society while Angola was a pastoral society, therefore trade between the two became inevitable. Another factor that explains the development of intersocietal trade was the differences in technological advancements among societies and regions. While many historians, especially the Eurocentric historians, regarded Africa as primitive even by 1855, it is evident that some societies were more developed than others technologically. Several African societies had through ages undergone ages of transformation to some sort of modernity and could produce items which other societies could not. Like Uganda by 1855 could produce bark cloth, Benin produced wood carvings and those made of bronze, while some societies had attained iron working skills. Therefore, the differences in the levels of technology necessitated trade exchange. Differences in natural endowments. While God blessed man abundantly, he endowed men differently, and this is true for societies, so the need for exchange. For example, some societies were endowed with different minerals like copper, silver, gold, while others had none. Further still, the differences in geographical locations forced societies to engage in trade simply because their localities/locations influenced their relations with the outside world. The coastal societies of Africa were quick to embrace trade with the outside world because of their early contact with the outside world. For many reasons, trade developed in Africa, and by 1855, there were three significant trade systems in Africa, namely the Maghreb trade system in North Africa, which closely related to the Mediterranean and European trade system. The West African trade complex, which has been referred to as the legitimate trade system, which replaced the old slave trade Atlantic trade system triangular. The East and Central Africa trade complex, and these involve societies between the East and African coastal areas and the African Atlantic coastline between Namibia in the south and Cameroon to the north. This was by far the most complex trade system, for it involved many societies, and it was transcontinental, for it bridged East African coast with the West African coast. This is what came to be known as long-distance trade system. Emphasis here has been put on long-distance trade in East and Central Africa as well as legitimate trade in West African history. Pre-colonial African trade complexes. Long-distance trade in East and Central Africa. East and Central Africa refers to that area that covers the present-day states of Kenya, which was inhabited by the Akamba, Nandi, Kikuyu, coastal Swahili Arabs. Tanganyika, which was inhabited by coastal Arabs, the Zanzibaris, the Nyamwezi, the Chaga, Wanindo, Modambai, and Ngoni, and yet to the south, not forgetting the Hihi. Uganda, inhabited by Acholi, Langi to the north, the Aitso, Jisu and Soga to the east, the Ganda, the Banyoro, Ankole people, the Batoro and Kiga to the west and south. Nyasaland and Malawi, where we find the Yao, Bena, Ngoni and Amachinga people. Present-day Zambia, Zimbabwe, where we have the Shona people. Mapel, Ngwato and the Kololo people. Congo is part of Central Africa, where we find the Luba people, Azan, the Viri people, and others. Angola, as a part of Central Africa, was inhabited by the Sosa, Bisa Ovimbandu and Chokwe people, Ambo. Belundo, Mozambique, we find the Gaza, Boru, Tsonga, Masangano, Masangair people. It is imperative to note that this vast region with diversity of tribes and people was involved in the complex long-distance trade. Organization of the long-distance trade. There were many trade items that were exchanged in the trade. The main exports included beeswax and ostrich feathers. Imports, on the other hand, included guns, gunpowder, beads, iron products, and other trinkets. The method of exchange was originally barter, later a form of real commodity currency, and cowrie shells were introduced in the exchange. The participants in the trade included people from East and Central Africa's interior as well as foreigners. Prominent interior participants included the Yao, Bisa, Kakwi, Nyamwezi, Baganda, and the Banyoro. Key foreign trading groups included the Arabs, Swahili. The various participants found themselves engaged in the long-distance commercial transactions for various reasons that ranged from geographical ones to profitability. The interior communities played many important roles in the organization of the trade along trade routes. Whereas some foreigners joined caravans to the interior in search of ivory, many of the foreigners remained at the coastal islands of Zanzibar, Pemba, Reunion, and Madagascar. Among the people who remained at the coast were financiers. These included the Indian Banyans and Swahili. Merchants who provided credit facilities to traders who went inland. On return, the traders from the interior had to pay interest on the loaned capital and were required to sell the items collected to those that had provided them loans. Apart from providing credit, traders who remained at the coast had the responsibility of organizing the buying, shipping, and the export of ivory and slaves. Meanwhile, trade inland was usually conducted by caravan. Caravans varied in size, ranging from a few people. African history, pre-colonial African trade complexes. For security, the traders never took chances. In some cases, protection was provided by interior political leaders such as Mirambo and Nguema. All the same time, traders behaved in such a way that posed no threat to the people whose countries they went through or even carried weapons for self-defense in foreign lands. In some cases, diplomacy would be used by the traders. For instance, the Kokwe used to pay half of the ivory to the local chiefs to enable them conduct their trade peacefully. The chief means of transport in the long-distance trade was the use of porters. Business was conducted on 3 main routes which started on the East African coast. The 4th route started from the present Sudan Republic. Reasons for the involvement of various peoples in the long-distance trade. The participants in long-distance trade were the coastal Arabs, the Swahili, the Kamba, and the Kikuyu in Kenya, who dominated the northern trade route. The Nyamwezi, Chaga, Gogo, and Hihi dominated the central route, which was later joined by the Baganda and the Banyoro of Uganda, while the Yao, Ngoni, and Amachinga dominated the southern route that traversed southern Tanzania and Nyasaland. The southern route continued into Central Africa to involve the Shona, Maybelt, Chokwe, Bisa, Luba, Ovimbanju, and Sosa of Central Africa. Many people of East and Central Africa participated in the long-distance trade in one way or the other. The list is endless because many people in the Congo Basin also participated. Some of these were the Viri people, the Azan and the Boshi, to mention but a few. There are various reasons that account for the involvement in the long-distance trade. As noted earlier on, the development of intersocietal trade into interstate trade led to the involvement of these particular people in this economic activity. As neighboring societies exchanged goods and services like the Kamba and Kikuyu and the coastal Arabs of Mombasa. The Yao and Ngoni and Amachinga people exchanged goods and services. The Baganda, Banyoro, and Banyanko also carried out trade. Another reason that explains the involvement of these people in the long-distance trade was the increased contact of the East African coast to the outside world, which created scarcity of some goods at the coast. This partly explains why the chief merchants such as Tipi established commercial empires in Congo as a constant supply in ivory, slaves. Furthermore, the establishment of a clove industry in Zanzibar, Pemba Islands created demand for slave labor, and this explains why the Nyamwezi, Yao, Ngoni, and others joined as the chief supporters of slaves to the East African coastal areas. It is imperative to note also that the spread of the Industrial Revolution in Europe created new economic demands. African history, pre-colonial African trade complexes. The growth of a network of trade routes later influenced some tribes to join the long-distance trade. Those tribes/societies that lived along the trade routes eventually got involved in the long-distance trade either as suppliers of trade items, porters, guides, or providers of other services such as food, shelter, or accommodation to the traders like the Akamba, Kikuyu in the northern route, Nyamwezi and Hi'i, Baganda, and Banyoro in the central route, and the Katamas from Sudan, the Ngoni and Yao in the southern route. The advancement in technology is another reason that explains the involvement of some people in LDT. Various societies had developed technological skills in ironworking, salt mining, back cloth making, and superior techniques in hunting. This therefore enabled them to produce goods that were on demand, and as such, they got involved in the LDT like the Kamba, elephant hunters, ironworking among the Maitbel of Central Africa, and the Baganda with bark cloth making. Other societies joined due to geographical factors like the strategic position of a given society determined its movement. There are societies that got involved due to this factor, like coastal Arabs had access to trade routes in the outside world, the Nyamwezi, etc. The climatic conditions also played a part in the involvement, for it's climate that determines the flora and fauna. Some societies were naturally endowed with elephants and other animals to provide hides and skins. Also, for example, the Nyamwezi, the rainy and hence agricultural season was between March and November, leaving December-February as a period of redundancy. Thus they had time at their disposal to engage in the LDT due to such a regular seasonal pattern. Closely linked to the above was the degree of specialization in some societies like among the Kokwe. Once men had finished cleaning the fields, the rest of the agricultural work was left for the women. This left men with ample time for trade. In that way, the Kokwe men were able to engage in LDT. The desire to acquire firearms by many East and Central African societies drove them into LDT. This was particularly true during the second half of the 19th century, 1850–90, when many societies embarked on developing standing armies like Uganda, Nyamwezi under Mirambo, the Maple under Lubengula, Hihiana, Mkwawa, Kokri, and Ovimandu of Angola. It is also argued that the desire to acquire wealth, political influence, and prestige drove many African leaders, chiefs, and kings at the time to get involved in LDT. This partly explains why the trade remained a royal trade, a monopoly of the royalists/aristocracy. Impacts of the long-distance trade to the people of East and Central Africa. Given the extent and coverage of this trade and the involvement of many people, the trade had profound impacts. African history, pre-colonial African trade complexes. Politically, the trade led to the enlargement or territorial expansion of some states as they strived to enlarge their commercial empires in bid to secure sources of trade items. Some societies extended their boundaries, like Maple people of Ndebele State, Uganda, the Hihi Kingdom, and others. On the contrary, however, the weaker statues declined as their weaknesses were exploited by the larger and stronger states. Some states collapsed while others were reduced to vassal status. It is also important to note that some states emerged as new political entities from the ruins of those that had collapsed, like the great empire of Mutapa in Central Africa gave way to the rise of new states such as Maple and Kololo states and the like. New men, the merchant princes, rose to positions of prominence/leadership as a result of participation in the LDT. The new men of common origin used their profits from the trade to create themselves large commercial empires that had not existed before, like Mirambo and his Nyamwezi state, Nyungwe, Moa, Msiri, and Tiptapu, who created commercial empires in Katanga region. These empires were very influential until the advent of colonial rule. The formation of these new political entities and the enlargement of others ushered in an era of centralized politics in East and Central Africa, and this began with the evolution of centralized states coupled with the evolution of standing armies created around personalities. These armies were instrumental trade agents and partners of the aristocracies of East Africa like Kabilku Sabarzura, Mirambo's Ruga mercenaries, Uganda's army, etc. It is imperative to note that the era of LDT between 1840–1890 was characterized by both peace and insecurity at the same time. While those societies that participated in this trade enjoyed peace and security, they at the same time plundered their neighbors in search for slaves and other trade items. In essence, therefore, there was relative peace. The majority of East and Central Africa suffered at the hands of the slaves. Furthermore, long-distance trade paved way for the European colonization of East and Central Africa was opened up to the outside world. The routes into the interior were the same routes used by the explorers, missionaries, and later on the imperialists. In essence, therefore, LDT opened up the interior of East Africa to foreign influences, intrusion, and colonial rule. Worse still, LDT portrayed Africa's economic potentials, which incited European economic imperialism, which later manifested itself in the colonization of the continent. It is through LDT that the outside world got to know that Africa possessed valuable materials such as precious minerals, crops, and a large population that would later provide market for industrialized Europe. From the economic point of view, there was equally substantial impact. The region of East and Central witnessed African history, pre-colonial African trade complexes. In the same view, African products got market in the international market. This laid foundation for the future relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. Africans became producers to the rest of the world. African communities exported goods such as ivory, wood carvings, timber, her own slaves, precious minerals, etc. There was a remarkable increase in the productivity of African economies. Large amounts of salt, ivory, cloves, copper, and gold were exported as many of the participants in trade grew wealthier and richer. On the contrary, however, Africa as a continent lost its most energetic and valuable manpower through slave trade. During this era and activity, the young and most energetic population was sold into slavery. This therefore meant that a generation of the energetic was lost completely. This partly explains why Africa is still lagging behind. It also explains categorically why African resistances against colonial rule were crushed. The fighting force had been sold away, greatly weakened. Despite this, however, above, LDT laid the foundation of modern transport and communication network. The very trade routes followed by caravan traders were later developed into modern communication lines, either as railways, roads, or waterways. So LDT erased the work of surveyors and constructors. It is on this background, therefore, that the European imperialists formed the African transport system like the Uganda Railway followed. Socially, LDT affected African institutions in the region. In the first instance, there was a remarkable decline in human dignity as people in the hands of slaves. Villages were plundered, homesteads destroyed, souls perished as slave traders raided to secure slaves, people lived in fear. Human beings were reduced to trade items and to make matters worse by their own leaders. Such a situation of hopelessness in mankind, and this partly explains why some Africans collaborated with the invading forces during the second half of the 19th century. Some supported the imperialists, while others were converted to Christianity. In essence, so LDT and slave trade, and LDT in particular, undermined the African traditional values and the African leaders. Through LDT, there was spread of Islam from the East African coast into the interior of East and Central Africa. Many of the Arab/caravan traders were Muslims. They spread the Islamic faith to many of the people involved in the trade. But the trade also influenced the spread of Christianity, as the early explorers wrote horrific stories about slave trade. They incited the coming of new European Christian missionaries who struggled and advocated for the abolition of slave trade. In the 1860s and 1870s, a great influx of great European missionary groups was witnessed into Africa. Like the Church Missionary Society, the White Fathers, the Holy Ghost Fathers, London Missionary Society, University Mission to Central Africa, Parish Evangelical Mission who operated in the region. It is these missionaries who African history, pre-colonial African trade complexes. As the Yao, Akamba and Nyamwezi societies, as discussed already, each controlled its own trade route officially until the last quarter of the 19th century, when it started declining steadily. The causes for its decline are discussed below. By 1880s, competition for long-distance trade items had come to its climax, with many new East African societies interested in joining the LDT business. Like in Kenya, the Akamba often fought with the Nandi in competition for rare products such as ivory, which the Arabs wanted most in Kenya. Following this cut-throat competition, the communities near the coast prevented the inland societies from reaching the coast. They could either torture or force them to pay high taxes in order to let them pass through. Their land, like the Nyamwezi, did not allow the Baganda to pass through that land. The Banyoro also were often refused to cross Ankle and began to go into the coast, hence leading to the decline of the trade. Presence of insecurity created by bandits. Almost in all trade routes, they had a problem of way rebels. Like the central route that was occupied by the Nyamwezi had a group of bandits known as Riga and Mviti who molested/tortured traders from the central route, whereas hostile Zaramo, Yikimbu, Como molested traders from Kenya. They stole their products, killed wild many. The depletion of trade items like elephant population due to overhunting affected ivory products, and this contributed to the decline of LDT. By 1890s, it was hard to acquire a lot of ivory for trade with the coastal communities. The elephants had been forced to migrate to distant areas, or else they were killed in large numbers, especially after the introduction of guns. The death of outstanding long-distance traders, merchant princes almost at the same time, and continuous assassination of African chiefs by the Swahili and Arab traders in search of trade items also contributed to the decline of LDT. Mirambo, Nyumbi Emo and Kabaka Mutiso, one of Buganda, all died in the same year, 1884, whose active participation and organizational abilities had led to the success or growing of the LDT, and unfortunately the successors lacked such abilities. The period of scramble and partition of Africa. In the 19th century period, it led to the coming in of varying many Europeans who were interested in legitimate trade that led to the closure/collapse of this LDT. Like missionaries in particular condemned the Slave Trade Act and advocated for the growth of cash crops, which provided the raw materials that European industries needed at the time. Perhaps if European industries had not arrived in East Africa at the end of the 19th century, LDT would have continued a little longer. The role of African communities in LDT of East and Central Africa. East and Central Africa refers to the area that covers the present-day states of Kenya, which was inhabited by the Akamba, Nandi, Kikuyu, coastal Swahili, and Arabs. Tanganyika, which was inhabited by coastal Arabs, the Zanzibaris, the Nyamwezi, the Chaga, Wanyendo, Matambai, Ngoni, and Yao to the south, not forgetting the Hihi. Uganda, inhabited by Acholi, Langi to the north, the Atzo, Jisu and Soga to the east, the Ganda, the Banyoro, Ankle people, the Batoro and Kiga to the west and south. Nyaisland, Malawi, where African history, pre-colonial African trade complexes. Roles. Africans served as porters, provided transport services, i.e., carried items like ivory to the coast. Organized caravans to the coast like the Yao, Akamba. These initiated the trade. Provided security to traders on routes, especially leaders, peace and stability, Chief and Dakir of Anyanyam. Morambo of Nyamwezi. Guided the traders to where trade items could be obtained like the Nyamwezi, Yao, Akamba. Acted as interpreters and translators to foreigners. Provided items of trade, i.e., slaves, hunted for ivory, rhinoceros horns, honey, agricultural raw materials. Played middlemanship role between the vast interior and the coast. Provided market for foreign goods/Arab goods like guns, gunpowder, mirrors, clothes. Acted as trade items since they were sold as slaves. Established trade relations with coastal traders like Arabs, Swahili, that encouraged them to venture into the interior like the Nyamwezi traders that came to Ugo, Rambo, Yili and Kiruru. Provided accommodation/feeding to the coastal and other traders in the interior. Fought off foreign interference that would disrupt the trade like Mirambo against Ngoni north of his empire. Signed trade agreements with external traders to improve the trade aka Mirambo with Sultan Bargasha. Zanzibar Chief Fundikira of Anyanyam Sayed said. Regulated trade and traders by charging them taxes or tributes through other empires like those who passed through Mirambo's empire. Legitimate trade in West Africa in the 19th THC. This was the greatest effect of the abolition of slave trade. Legitimate trade can be defined as illegal trade which was established after the abolition of slave trade. It dealt with material products like agricultural raw materials/crops as cocoa, rubber, coffee, cotton, nuts, palm oil, coconuts, mineral raw materials like copper, gold, other raw materials like ivory, etc., and not human beings. Slave trade can be defined as the actual buying and selling of human beings, while slavery is the absolute possession of human beings by another. The campaign against slave trade was started by Britain in 1807 and African history, pre-colonial African trade complexes. The major exports of legitimate trade in West Africa were palm oil from Calabar and Niger Delta/palm kernels and palm wood from Sierra Leone, groundnuts from Gambia, gold and ivory from Gold Coast and Ivory Coast respectively, while beeswax and ostrich feathers from Gambia and Cameroon. Imports to West Africa included textiles, guns, gunpowder, spirits, whisks, tobacco, beads, glassware, etc. Aims for establishment of legitimate trade. To completely replace slave trade activities. To enhance production of raw materials to feed European manufacturing industries. Establish strong European markets for their manufactured goods. Compensate the businessmen who had invested in abolition of slave trade. Provide work for freed slaves, i.e., enslave them on their own land, Africa, in production of raw materials. Problems involved in transition from slave trade to legitimate trade in West Africa. There arose a strong opposition from European countries such as Portugal, France, whose economy still depended on African slave labor on their plantations. Besides this, such countries wanted to industrialize just like Britain. They used slaves before proper industrial sector could take off. The crops suggested to replace slave trade such as rubber, cocoa, palm oil could not grow in some places of West Africa. Palm oil, coconuts needed a long time to mature than the British expected. Therefore, items for trade were in short supply at the start. The emergency of financial problems which came about as a result of paying for transport of available goods, unlike before when slaves transported themselves to the coast from the interior. There was also no immediate source of income from legitimate trade as these crops took long to mature. There was also lack of funds to compensate the slave traders for losing their most important source of income. Differences in religion and culture. There was no correspondence in religion. Supporters of anti-slavery were mostly Christians, yet West Africa was predominantly Muslim region at least by the second half of the 19th century. They therefore hated slave trade abolitionists as they considered them infidels. Social problems in Europe were worse than those in Africa, like there was social evils such as prostitution, underemployment of workers, child labor, etc. Many Africans argued that Britain and all other slave trade abolitionists should solve their problems in Europe first before intervening in slave trade activities in Africa, which made the exercise quite difficult. The number of anti-slavery manpower was small compared to a big area they were controlling along the Atlantic Ocean on the West African coastline. Therefore, this patrol group was often dodged by the slave traders, making the whole exercise difficult in West Africa. In some West African societies, such as Dahomey, slaves were acceptable by customs and culture. It was part of their ways of life. Such societies had to forcefully continue with slave trade despite the fact that measures were put in place by the abolitionists in West Africa. The anti-slavery patrol concentrated at the coast for a long time. The British and other abolitionists had concentrated at the coast of West Africa, leaving the interior unattended to. Therefore, slavery had to continue inland. This was made worse by Britain, which had no practical punishment put in place for those who insisted on African history, pre-colonial African trade complexes. Slave trade in West Africa was partly organized by top political officers such as kings and chiefs. This made it difficult to stop it. Moreover, slave trade was a means through which rulers would get rid of criminals from their societies, like Chief George of Apobo sold some of his subjects into slavery. Some slaves had gotten used to the life of slavery. They were not sure of making a living as free people. They were unskilled to be resettled in an independent life. They were therefore unwilling to break away from slavery, and that when the campaign started, many slaves went to hide away in European suburbs, fearing to be brought back to Africa. Nevertheless, the transition to legitimate trade came with its problems of enslaving Africans on their own land, cultivating cash crops which they needed as raw materials in their industries in Europe. These crops were bought cheaply or exchanged with valuable European products like mirrors, glasses, used clothes, etc., which made Africans ask themselves lamenting questions such as, to what extent was legitimate trade legitimate? Effects of legitimate trade in West Africa. The first and most important was that instead of being a commodity, the African became a human being again with material and spiritual needs to be satisfied. However, this was followed by colonization that took away social, political, and economic independence of these African societies. There was emergence of two classes of Africans following the increased commercial activities in Africa, like there was a middle class consisting of private traders, businessmen, a working class made up of people employed by various trading companies. Many more trading firms, mainly from Britain and France, were attracted to West Africa. This resulted into rivalry to competition between companies, leading to the birth of one giant company known as Royal Niger. Company R& Co., which was a chartered company of the British origin. Traders, like missionaries, also constantly appealed for home government protection to establish peace and order to beat down the opposition of African middlemen. It was in response to such appeals that West Africa was occupied by the Europeans in the 19th century. Urbanization effect. Following the growth of legitimate trade, many new trading posts and stations in the interior were established to accommodate the activities of legitimate traders. Those later grew into bigger towns like Onitsha and Lokoja towns became famous in West Africa as a result of legitimate trade activities. Enhanced the importation of European products and articles which changed the African way of life, like dressing, eating, housing, etc. On the other hand, killed the development of African art and craft as once observed by Mahmud Mandan that an African entered colonization with a hoe he made himself and came out with an imported one. It led to introduction of new economic systems in West Africa, like West African economy became monetized with introduction of new currencies, box system, credit facilitation. This broke away the traditional use of barter system. Due to the need of transporting goods inland and collecting raw materials, there were infrastructural developments. A number of railway lines connecting West Africa and the interior to the coast, like a railway from Lagos reached Kano in 1911 in Nigeria. Ghana Gold Coast, a railway line was established connecting Accra with Sekondi and Tarkwa in 1901 purposely for gold collection. In absence of such railway system, seasonal feeder. African history. Pre-colonial African trade complexes. There came trade monopoly and competition divided between Africans and Europeans, like African Native Trading Company was in stiff competition with French trading firms and British firms like Liverpool and Manchester. To beat off other firms, George Goldie organized all British firms in West Africa and formed one giant Royal Niger Company that traded and colonized a big part of West Africa for the British. Legitimate trade left West African economies tied to those of Europe in a permanent dependency as they determined the nature of West African products and their prices, and at the same time determined the type of manufactured goods to be imported with their prices to West Africans. Revision questions. 1. Examine the effects of the long-distance trade on peoples of East Africa during the second half of the 19th century, Annette 2014. 2. Describe the factors for the decline of the long-distance trade in East Africa, Annette 2012. 3. Examine the organization and impacts of long-distance trade on East Africa. Annette 2003. 4. Assess the impact of long-distance trade on the people of East and Central Africa during the second half of the 19th century. Annette 1998. 5. Examine the ways in which the West African economy changed after abolition of slave trade in 1990. 6. What role did the Banyoro play in the long-distance trade of the Great Lakes region? Annette 1990. 7. With examples, show why various people of East Africa got involved in the long-distance trade in the 19th century. 8. Assess the role of the Nyamwezi in pre-colonial long-distance trade. 9. Discuss the role of Marambo and Tiputip in the development of long-distance trade. 10. Account for the growth of long-distance trade during the 19th century. 11. Discuss the problems encountered in the transition from slave trade to legitimate trade in West Africa. 12. Examine the economic effects of the transition from slave trade to legitimate trade in West Africa in the second half of the 19th century.